Warhammer 40K Space Marine is one of those games you don't hear a ton about anymore, but when you do, it's always favorable. So with an impending sequel coming out in early September 2024, I thought, what better time to satisfy my curiosity and see what the buzz was all about, and get stuck in like a chain sword through an orc. For the Imperium, motherfucker!
The Codex Astartes does not support this action.
So, Warhammer 40K Space Marine, which we'll mercifully shorten to just Space Marine forthwith, is a 2011 linear third-person action game made by Relic Entertainment, who had been making real-time strategy games since 1999, including their very own Warhammer series called Dawn of War. Now, you might think it a bit strange to go straight into third-person action from real-time strategy, but Relic had already had a practice run with their third-person squad-based shooter called The Outfit, which released on the Xbox 360 in 2006. But Relic knew that adding melee combat and fine-tuning the animation systems was going to be a tougher nut to crack than mere third-person shooting, so they recruited veteran devs from the Gears of War, God of War, and Far Cry series to make sure that the game felt right. Jim Preston, in an E3 2011 interview with Games on Net, said that
Again, another one of our goals for this game was to introduce 40K to a broader audience. We've tried to set the world in something that, we've set the game in a single world. So you're not hopping back and forth between a lot of environments. We stick with the orcs and we stick with the Chaos Marines, so it doesn't become sort of a zoo of enemies where the new player is overwhelmed by keeping track of a lot of characters and a lot of different enemies.
And Space Marine does prove that simplicity can be a strength, as it's consistent throughout. So consistent, in fact, that despite its fun combat and great presentation, it always feels like it's limiting itself by not going for broke on some set pieces or having a little more oomph in its story beats. The game's rhythm is admittedly satisfying combat, punctuated by long, empty corridors, and only occasional set pieces that are over before you know it, which could be budget constraints, but it could also just be an overly conservative vision. So in the end, Space Marine's an exceedingly satisfying ground-level action game, but one which feels overly long despite its modest runtime, because it only seems to want to be good, not great. But let's not despair, because wanting more means that the team at Relic did enough to make me interested in the first place. So let's get straight into what works, starting with the presentation.
We're about to find out.
Now, from the opening credits, this game nails an epic vibe, full of edgy pomp and circumstance, elevating what is essentially a text message conversation between Imperium members into peak suspense. The swell of strings and horns and the crash of timpani from Chris Velasco and Sonic Mayhem's absolutely stellar soundtrack will have you fist-pumping by the time the Imperium's like, "Yo, orcs be mad and invading. We need the Ultramarines to wreck face starting yesterday." Seriously, this game's soundtrack is so good, you can listen to it by itself. Space Marine also looks the part. There's a crispness and a smart sense of contrast in Space Marine's art design, made even more impressive by the fact that the game looks a little overcast at times and could have easily just smudged out all that detail. Even on the Xbox 360 that I played, the presentation was really solid. But anyway, that's the look and the feel of the world. But as for our characters, their models and voice work are solid AF. Our hero, Captain Titus, his band of brothers, and the orcs they fight all have a comic book realism to them. Uncanny enough to be believable, but just exaggerated and cool looking enough to appeal to the imagination. Speaking of Titus, upon hearing his voice, my ears perked up. The night before I started playing Space Marine, I had just watched a movie called The Catcher Was a Spy, about an old pro baseball player who's tasked by the Allies to assassinate Werner Heisenberg, the German scientist that the Allies suspected was building an atom bomb for Nazi Germany. Heisenberg was played by Mark Strong, and despite his German brogue, I could still hear that same timbre that I'd heard coming from Captain Titus. Unfortunately, Mark Strong's hair is not too much better in this game than that movie, but alas, I guess he looks rough and tumbled here in a very Hulk kind of way, and I'm all for that. Goofy jokes aside, Strong does a commendable job here with some rather straightforward material, and I appreciated that in his interview, he seemed to take this world rather seriously as an artistic endeavor, noting that voice acting in games takes a unique skill to do well, and that there must really be something to Warhammer for it to have endured for so long. There's a lot of John Bernthal playing D&D with Deborah Ann Wall for the first time energy. Just a guy who's clearly an outsider, but open to learning and having fun because others like it so much. But yeah, he carries the experience with a steady performance, and the rest of the cast performs their material rather admirably. The only problem is that the material doesn't give them much to work with. Ultramarines are extremely stolid, serious guys who don't emote very much, and there's not a lot of thematic headiness to consider as you slaughter everything in sight.
We're out of options.
Early scenes really sell you on the horrors of war as you walk past the injured, and there is a good scene at the end where a young soldier is asked to reconsider how his cold by-the-book approach may be blinding him to the best outcome for the conflict. It's not the greatest game story ever written, but there are some good moments, and it's a very tasteful and respectful adaptation of the Warhammer IP with nice production values. That's to be commended. There's strength and simplicity. But I do want to dive real quick into some story specifics, so spoiler warning, skip to here if you wish to abstain. Okay, so like I said, the story is fairly straightforward. Titus and his Ultramarine pals are brought in to stop a very bad orc invasion on the weapons manufacturing planet of Graia, which also houses the Titan Invictus mech that they can't let fall into the wrong hands. After pulling off some operations to sabotage the orcs' efforts, Titus comes into contact with a power source made of warp energy, and much to his compatriots' alarm, he's not affected by it when it bathes him in its energies. See, in Warhammer, those not affected by the warp are the evil forces of chaos, who are basically demons and hell and all that. The game leaves the door open for why Titus is not affected by these energies despite his commitment to the Imperium, but it remains a source of distrust among his allies as long as the game goes on. Soon, the forces of chaos make their appearance, and it's revealed that the Inquisitor that we've been working with was actually under the control of Nemeroth, who is attempting to use the power source to become a demon prince. We battle through the forces of chaos to stop him, but our victory doesn't prevent Titus from being reported by his young comrade Leandros as a traitor, because Titus clearly has to be in league with the forces of chaos in order to be able to withstand repeated exposure to the warp energy in the power source. Titus remains resolute, saying he doesn't know why this is occurring, but that Leandros' rigidity to the code has blinded him to Titus's loyalty and fortitude, and that it's unbefitting of an Ultramarine.
The Codex Astartes is a set of rules. They guide us, shape us as Ultramarines, teach us to hold duty and honor sacred above all. But how we live with those rules is the true test of a Space Marine. And you have failed.
This is the best moment in the whole story because it sets up a suspenseful cliffhanger as to why Titus would be immune to the warp, and it also recontextualizes how one should view Titus and his whole life's mission. It's a bit late to start making me care, as every other complication has been a light but exceedingly dry militaristic development like, there's a blockade on the Eastern Front, relocate all reinforcements to the rear guard, on the double, men, on the double, or whatever soldiers in entertainment say. The story is simple, serviceable, but a little too po-faced. It's grimdark, as the title sequence is quick to remind us, but I take a little bit more dark and interesting over simply grim. It never quite escalates in a particularly impressive way, despite all the marketing speak that Relic put out about its
huge sprawling storyline and amazing characters and like super high production values.
Okay. That said, the story moves along well enough, and I'm excited to see the sequel pick up where this game left off, at least on the mystery of Titus's warp resistance, and maybe strive for some bigger and more varied set pieces. So the story's fine, but rather predictable and doesn't go anywhere terribly interesting other than the ending cutscene. But fortunately, it doesn't really have to do the heavy lifting. It's just a nice contextualization for what you're doing. After all, the real draw here is the absolutely brutal combat. Relic was not shy about how good they thought their game's combat was, and understandably so. Although some of their descriptions are Pitchford-style marketing hooey, where everything is awesome all the time.
As soon as you have the controller in your hands, you understand that Space Marine is a completely different experience. That seamless blend of melee and shooting and the progression in the game really creates a very interesting, unique combat experience that probably we've never seen before.
And then another gentleman calling it an action RPG full of customization.
We're really excited. We built this team from the ground up to take advantage of new technology that we've also built from the ground up to create the most definitive Warhammer 40,000 action RPG game that there is for the console space.
Oh, you know what? When did this interview come out? Oh, look, the same year as Borderlands, the series that made everybody think that if something has an upgrade tree, then it must be an RPG. That checks out. Digs aside, though, Relic does have a reason to be proud of their simple but very fun combat system. It apes much of the best parts of Gears of War and God of War, as you'd imagine considering it shares some of the same developers, but in a pleasingly seamless way where the brutal melee of God of War transitions at will into the frenetic, gory shootouts of the Gears franchise. And yet, it never really overcomplicates things, keeping the action straightforward, but so full of awesome feedback that the lack of complexity means there's no barrier keeping the player from having the most fun the fastest.
What we had gone for originally was a simpler sort of one-button style combat, and we've evolved that a little bit, but tried to keep it simple. But we've added a few more wrinkles, a little more depth, without taking it all the way into the brawler world of combat where you have to remember certain combos or you have to get your timing down in certain windows.
In that regard, Space Marine lets you do what you couldn't in Gears, which is switch to the chainsaw at will, or, unlike God of War, actually being able to pick off dudes at exceptional range instead of just having to reach them with your Blades of Chaos. In that regard, Space Marine is unique, and it's a whole lot of fun because of how satisfying both modes are, especially in tandem. Your melee weapon of choice is usually a chainsword, which is exactly as cool as it sounds, and it just totally tears ass. But you also get a power axe and a thunder hammer. Now the thunder hammer is devastatingly powerful, and the game's not shy about letting you just plow through enemies like Thor, smashing the ground and sending tons of enemies into the air in bite-sized pieces. But the amount of delay that the hammer takes to be usable again makes it less tenable for me on the hard difficulty I played on, so I was much more partial to the speed and only a little less damaging power axe. I mean, the chainsword is iconic and it feels so good to use, but the room clearing ability of the axe combined with its speed is really the most versatile melee weapon in my opinion, so I never used anything else if given the option. But if you are trying to keep your distance, you'll also get to engage in some meaty Gears of War-esque shooting, even down to how using the right bumper on an Xbox 360 reloads and gives you a bonus. I say Gears because the bolter shreds through guys and has that light, loose feel of the Lancer, and the animations as you strafe feel very similar. That said, I'd hazard to say that the bolt gun here is actually a more satisfying weapon than even the Lancer, my preferred Gears weapon, because the bolt gun causes so much damage, ripping through enemies with a thunderous report and making headshots feel extremely personal. You'll also have an unlimited ammo pistol variant at your side at all times, and this eventually gets upgraded to a plasma variant, but you've also got supplementary weapons that you can slot between at various weapon stations throughout, like a sniper rifle and its laser cannon variety if you really want to delete guys, a plasma gun, which is slightly worse than the plasma pistol in my opinion, a melta gun, which is super powerful but also incredibly low on ammo, so it's not really worth picking up, and my personal favorite, the Vengeance Launcher. This explosive firing machine lets you stick enemies with its projectiles and detonate them at your leisure, so you can take out crowds or just avoid the hassle of trying to melee past some of the biggest butthole enemies in the game, which is often a death wish otherwise. Overall, the arsenal has great feedback, a ton of cool spectacle, and a lot of that comes from the supplementary abilities that Titus has. Like almost every other third-person action game, there's a Fury mode whose meter goes up a little bit for every hit given and received, and when that meter's full, you can turn it on to deal tons of damage and throw guys around like ragdolls, or slow down time to shoot fools like bullet time. It's the most 2000s game design thing ever, but the spectacle is outrageously fun and it's a tried and true mechanic for a reason. But what makes this ability work better than the average actioner is that it plays right into the whole design philosophy that Relic was going for.
The thing that we're most excited about that has really come together recently is we have always tried to get players to want to rush into combat. You know, Space Marine is, he's 7 feet tall, he's covered in armor, he shouldn't be just sort of peeking out behind a tree trying to shoot guys. We wanted to encourage players to run towards the enemy.
Much like the push-forward combat model in Doom Eternal, Relic wants you to get into the fray to succeed, not sit back and snap to cover like the other over-the-shoulder third-person shooter inspiration in Gears of War. The game's hack and slash, but not focused on combos. You can shoulder charge while sprinting to just tear through guys, and your heavy attack is an auto stun on most enemies that brings up a God of War style finisher prompt to perform an execution. These are brutally satisfying blade kills that gain you a ton of health back, but they don't have any invincibility frames while performing them, meaning that you can get hit at any time. So while at first this ability seemed like an exploit, one button to stun an enemy for a one-hit follow-up kill, it quickly becomes apparent that this is a highly risky risky move and something that you have to work towards and use strategically, clearing out enough backstabbers so you can execute somebody to regain all the health you've lost so that you can finish off the last few opponents. It's smart, simple design with risks and rewards that incentivize you not to be greedy, while also dangling the carrot of just how cool it would look if you just charged in and won anyway. It doesn't happen very often, but it always seems just about possible. You attack in order to heal, and the lack of a cover system means that you'll have to be mobile anyway. That said, Space Marine does heavily lean on an unofficial cover system for the last 2 levels or so, despite Raphael Van der Rohe saying that there is really no place for a cover system unlike Gears.
We also have chosen to not have a Snap 2 cover system, which is sort of going to be a key differentiator for us, because pretty much every third-person action game has that right now. And the reasons for that are two. There's really 2 main reasons. One is that it was really not compatible with our desire to have a very seamless, kind of immediate feeling, satisfying melee system.
I spent much of the final 2 levels pop-shotting around the corners of incidental environmental cover to avoid the absolute hailstorm of incoming plasma fire that would have killed me otherwise. Some encounters just aren't winnable in a straight-up fight, and so you have to play like a chicken to get through them. For all the bluster about how your best defense is a good offense, the game definitely apes the design of other shooters without their conveniences. All that to say, I do appreciate that Relic at least designed areas with cover so that we can use them somewhat indirectly as opposed to not at all, and just hoping the dodge would get us out of bad situations. But all of that to say, the core combat is absolutely a step above the normal action game. No attack feels truly weak or doesn't look utterly sick in motion, and it's this constant power fantasy that makes it not only an essential Warhammer simulator, but also just a great action game that has no problem making the player feel capable and awesome without ever letting them be truly invincible or just letting them coast without having to play carefully. It's a tough balance, and it's certainly in the player's favor, but it's the perfect balance in my estimation. But games like Space Marine are the type of beast that are interested more in the thrill of the IP versus just making you grind and hope you get through eventually. And it really helps the pace too, although it certainly makes it all the more apparent when the game is repeating the same rhythm over and over again and never quite escalating into something really special. Blockbuster action was clearly a buzzword internally for Relic because nearly everyone interviewed repeats it ad nauseum for the press. And while it certainly applies to the ground combat, I always wish the game had done more of or more with its set pieces. There are 3 or 4 jetpack sequences that gift you a rather nice jetpack and thunderhammer to smash down onto foes from on high like an avenging angel, but all of them except maybe the last one are over too quickly. Something about them makes me want more from them rather than just me kind of pole vaulting onto enemies over and over again and then putting it down and moving on to the more traditional sections. I don't know, maybe I need to be dodging some incoming projectiles, or maybe I get to jump into some vehicles and hit them straight on with my hammer or something. I don't know, it just feels like there maybe should be a little bit more there. Other set pieces fare better, but I wish they went on a little bit longer. You defend a carrier with a turret as jetpacking orcs threaten to knock you and your comrades down to earth, and it's pretty tense, and I very nearly failed it, but got there just in the nick of time. I really like the difficulty of this section, making it feel like everything was about to go to pot. And I wouldn't have minded more last stand or imminent disaster moments like this. There's a similar set piece later on where you're on top of a train fighting off a gunship of sorts, and it's okay, but you pretty much just cheese it out by hiding behind something and popping out, and then you're done eventually. As for the boss fights, there are really only 2 that I remember, and the first one was pretty borked. Or is it pretty orked? I was extremely boxed in and only gifted with that crappy dodge move against quite a lot of enemies and projectiles, and eventually I died. But instead of grinding through the fight again, the game actually loaded me into the second phase of the fight with the boss up on a high place who was just a sitting duck for me to finish him off. I'm not sure exactly what cheated me ahead of the fight like this, but I guess it is merciful in the end. The mind boggles at how I was supposed to get through that fight otherwise, through just sheer attrition, I guess. And the last set piece that really didn't do it for me was the Invictus Titan. So this big mech is built up throughout the entire game to be this spectacular, ass-kicking machine. This Metal Gear-sized Hulk that's central to the conflict. The orcs want it, but can't possibly be allowed to get it, so let's take advantage of it while we can and turn the tides. The story makes it more and more apparent that we need it ourselves to destroy a transmission tower that's actually letting these demons in. And so I eagerly awaited this awesome section that I was imagining in my head where we get to control it and destroy everything in our path on our way to the tower. But no, we get to the top of the thing and it kind of ambles forward to the end of this room as the bay doors open. We shoot a couple mage type guys and then we just fire a blast at the transmission tower a billion miles in the distance, and then we get off. It's sort of emblematic of how Space Marine always feels like it's just about to pop off into something special, but keeps staying in the good but could have been great territory. That said, there is sort of a nice old school feel to it. It just gets the basics right, and that's surprisingly impressive 13 years later. It's never playing outside of its comfort zone, perhaps, but it's also not falling all over itself trying to pretend to be more interesting than it is. In fact, because Space Marine's core is so good, it's natural to start expecting it to keep getting bigger and better, which is a good problem to have. Is it totally unique and innovative and full of an amazing story and characters or some complex action RPG, as the developers would like to tell you it is? Absolutely not. But I'll be danged if I didn't have a really satisfying time with what Space Marine actually is and what it's good at, and that's beating the living shart out of orcs and chaos demons alike. Space Marines is a nice bite-sized chunk of adrenaline that successfully translates Warhammer lore into an approachable, respectable gore fest. The action is incredibly visceral and fun, and the only real drawbacks are how stiff the game can feel and how necessary kiting can be on the hard difficulty. I do also wish that the game did more with its scope than just suggest it by great big zoom-out wide shots of the hulking bridges and towers in the world, but hey, maybe that's something that Space Marine 2 could work out. And speaking of Space Marine 2, it's coming out almost 13 years to the date of the first game's launch, and holy crap, new developer Saber Entertainment keeps waxing on about how epic this game is going to be in every way over the original, and I really have to start agreeing that that's probably going to be the case. It's going to have 3-player campaign co-op, a wide selection of customization and upgrade options, an emphasis on classes, beautiful visuals, and honestly really satisfying looking action, and some new enemies to the series in the form of the Tyranids. I'm loving all these Red Faction Armageddon looking monsters, but just please, for the love of God, don't make them die to weak point shooting like every other monster in modern game design. But even if they do, Space Marine 2 looks really fun, and I like how Titus finally put on a flipping helmet as he wades into monster swarms. Safety first, Captain Titus. But yeah man, while you're waiting for this great looking game, go play Space Marine and get caught up, because I think this series could really become a surprise to you as it did for me. It's maybe 7 to 8 hours even on hard, so it's not too much of a time sink, it's consistently fun, and even though it wears out a bit towards the end, you're still going to be glad you played it, and it'll remind you of a simpler time that wasn't beset by microtransactions and false promises and feature creep, and just how good a game can be when it relies on the basics, when it proves that there's strength and simplicity. This I say, in the Emperor's name. Thanks for watching. I'd like to give a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by becoming a patron. Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Halcyon Goon, Hey Blondie, Yak Show, M, Bibby F. in Bloxburg, and Melancholy Geek. And an extra special thank you to those of you donating at my highest paid tiers, The Nth Review, James Wyatt, and Hot Hamlet. If you'd like to keep on what few lights I have here, you should join these folks at patreon.com/midnightmedium, or become a YouTube channel member, or donate at Ko-fi or PayPal. And also check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to support me with no cost to you. After all, there's no better place to celebrate the wonderfully weird till the sun comes up than with the Midnight Medium.